and I think we are in a good position to start. So good afternoon and welcome everyone to the launch of the 2024 edition of UNEP's annual Adaptation Gap Report. This report provides a science-based assessment of global progress on adaptation planning, financing, and implementation. And this year, it finds that nations must dramatically increase climate adaptation efforts, starting with a commitment to act on finance at COP29. My name is Keisha Rukikaire, Head of News and Media for UNEP, and I will be moderating this event. So with us today is the Executive Director of UNEP, Ms. Inge Anderson, and the report's Chief Scientific Editor, Henry Neufeld. Before we start, I'll run through a few housekeeping bits. We have about 40 minutes for this program, and we will start with a video message by the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, followed by remarks by Ms. Anderson, and then a presentation of the findings by the report's Chief Scientific Editor. After Henry, we'll have about 20-25 minutes for questions from the media. Now, as usual for good journalists with questions, you'll see a Q&A option on your screen. Please submit questions in writing in this box, and when you submit the questions, please specify your name and the media outlet you represent. As many of you already have the materials under embargo, please feel free to start putting your questions in the box immediately. So we'll get right on with it and launch straight into the video message by the Secretary General. Thank you.
Today's Adaptation Gap Report is clear. Climate calamity is the new reality. And we are not keeping up. Earth is ablaze and humanity is exposed. This year, we have suffered the hottest day and the hottest seas in the history books. 15 of the past 16 months have broken temperature records. And today, the World Meteorological Organization and partners tell us that 2024 is on track to be the hottest year ever recorded, almost 2 months before it ends. Humanity is torching the planet and paying the price. Look at the past 6 months. May, floods swept East Africa and Brazil, heatwave grips Asia. June, deadly heat in Mexico, the Middle East and the USA. July, the Caribbean's earliest ever Category 5 hurricane. August, Greek cities surrounded by flames. September, Hurricane Yagi strikes Southeast Asia, record wildfires reported in South America, the worst US hurricane since Katrina. And October, floods inflame crises in the Sahel and wreak havoc in Spain, where a year's worth of rain reportedly falls in just 8 hours. Behind each of these headlines is a human tragedy, economic and ecological destruction, and political failure. Climate catastrophe is hammering health, widening inequalities, harming sustainable development, and rocking the foundations of peace. The vulnerable are hardest hit, and taxpayers are footing the bill. While the purveyors of all this destruction, particularly the fossil fuel industry, reap massive profits and subsidies. Meanwhile, the gap between the funds needed for adaptation and the funds available to developing countries is set to reach up to $359 billion a year by 2030. We need urgent action in 4 areas. First, new national climate action plans, or NDCs, must set out adaptation planning, financing, and implementation needs clearly informed by high-quality data. Second, every person on Earth must be protected by an effective early warning system by 2027, in line with the United Nations Early Warnings for All initiative. Third, a massive increase in adaptation finance from public and private sources. Every country must have the means to protect themselves from climate extremes and seize the benefits of adaptation to drive progress across the Sustainable Development Goals. We need developed countries to double adaptation finance to at least $40 billion a year by 2025, an important step to close the finance gap. We need to unlock a new climate finance goal at COP29 and to build on the Pact for the Future by driving action on debt and substantially increasing the lending capacity of the multilateral development banks and their potential to leverage far more private finance. Today's report estimates that developing countries outside China are spending more on debt interest payments than they need for adaptation. Fourth, we must strike the heart of the crisis, greenhouse gases. The G20 must lead global efforts to cut emissions 9% a year to 2030, phase out fossil fuels fast and fairly, and accelerate the renewables revolution so that we limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The climate crisis is here. We can't postpone protection. We must adapt now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We must adapt now, indeed. Media colleagues, please feel free to start dropping your questions in the Q&A box. And now I will hand the floor to Ms. Anderson for her reflections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon from Nairobi, Kenya. As we've just heard from the UN Secretary General, the World Meteorological Organization and its partners have said that 2024 is likely to be the hottest recorded year ever. And that means that the record that we established, quote unquote, in 2023 just gets to stand for 1 year. And that is indeed a very clear sign that global temperatures are rising. Even now, we are still, when we're still under 1.5 degrees, the impacts are brutal. And we heard from the SG about the deadly floods, ferocious summer heat, and the worst drought in 100 years in Southern Africa, extreme storms across the globe. And we know that the impacts are predicted to get much worse. In fact, UNEP's emissions gap report that we released just over a week ago put the world on course with current policies to a 3.1 degrees at the end of this century. If we were to implement our commitments under the NDCs, we stand to be around 2.6 to 2.8 degrees. So nations have to bring together and use the next year's updates of their national determined contributions to really target and bring down by 2030 and 2035 greenhouse gas emissions to the levels that are consistent with the 1.5. And then they must urgently implement the pledges that they will write in those NDCs. But people are already dying, and homes and livelihoods are already being destroyed, and nature is already under assault. So it's clear that there is no choice but to adapt to that new climate reality. And that is why UNEP's Adaptation Gap Report 2024, come hell and high water, calls for nations to dramatically increase to adapt to climate change, starting with a commitment to ambitiously on adaptation finance at the upcoming COP29 climate talks. This enormous gap between adaptation finance on the one hand and flows on the other means that the world is failing to adapt fast enough. And yet, international public adaptation finance flows to developing countries increased from 2022 billion in 2021 to 28 billion in 2022. But much more is needed. And this urgent progress towards commitments, the commitments that we made under the Glasgow Climate Pact, which urge countries to at least double adaptation finance to developing countries from the 2019 levels by 2025. And that translates into a significant increase. And as the report bears out, we're still not there. So achieving that goal, even if we were to achieve the 38 billion by 2025, then that leaves a yawning gap of around between 190 billion to 360 billion per year. So we will only make an increase of about 5% towards the goal that we know we need to fill. Nations, therefore, must adopt an ambitious, new collective quantified goal for climate finance at COP29 in Azerbaijan, and they must pursue innovative approaches to mobilizing additional financial resources. But they must also back adaptation finance that has to be more anticipatory, more strategic, and more transformational. They must boost capacity building and technology transfer to developing countries. And they must include stronger adaptation components in the next round of the NDCs. The bottom line is that people, mainly the poor and the most vulnerable, live in even greater exposure to the consequences of climate change. So frankly, there's simply no excuse for the world not to get serious about adaptation. We need well-financed and effective adaptation that incorporates fairness and equity to protect against these impacts. And we need it now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson. We will now have a presentation of the key findings of the Adaptation Gap Report from its Chief Scientific Editor, Henry Neufeld. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Keisha. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present the key findings of the Adaptation Gap Report 2024, Come Hell and High Water. In the context of growing climate risks, the Adaptation Gap Reports provide science-based assessments of the global progress in adaptation to inform international climate change discussions under the UNFCCC. Besides describing progress in adaptation planning and implementation, this year's report focuses on ways to bridge the adaptation finance gap and looks at capacity building and technology transfer as critically important means to enhance the effectiveness of adaptation planning and implementation. Next slide, please. Is this the slide with the global coverage on it?
That's right, Henry.
As the figure shows, nearly 9 out of 10 countries now have at least one national adaptation planning instrument, that is, a policy, strategy, or plan, and more than half have at least a second one. But reaching some of the remaining 26 countries currently without an adaptation planning instrument may be hard, because several of them face internal fragility, conflict, or geopolitical tensions. These countries will require increased support to strengthen weak institutions and build capacity if all countries worldwide are to have a planning instrument by 2030. In addition to coverage, the quality of planning instruments is an important indicator. The report shows that the potential effectiveness of adaptation planning is mixed, and there is significant room for improvement. For example, there are shortcomings in the robustness of the evidence base and gaps regarding timeframes for and costs of adaptation priorities affecting their implementability. Moreover, the alignment of national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions needs to be improved so that these two instruments can mutually reinforce each other and enhance strategic investments. Next slide, please. The figure shows that despite some dips, adaptation actions are on an upward trend, but the pace of implementation is too slow to keep up with the increasing climate risks and urgently needs to accelerate. Moreover, the report shows that about half of analyzed adaptation projects are either not satisfactory in their results or are unlikely to be sustainable in the longer term. The report also reveals that progress in the implementation of national adaptation plans is hampered by a range of institutional, regulatory, financial, and capacity-related barriers. However, countries often overcome initial difficulties and then report significant progress of implemented actions. That notwithstanding, they also admit that the adequacy and effectiveness of the adaptation response is insufficient relative to mounting climate risks. Next slide. International public adaptation finance flows to developing countries increased from 22 billion in 21 to 28 billion in 2022, the largest absolute and relative year-on-year increase since the Paris Agreement. As the figure shows, this reflects progress towards the Glasgow Climate Pact, which urged developed nations to at least double adaptation finance to developing countries to circa 38 billion by 2025. Further significant increase is required to achieve this goal. But due to the enormous gap of 187 to 359 billion US dollars per year until 2030, reaching the Glasgow Climate Pact goal would only reduce the gap by about 5%. Bridging the adaptation finance gap is therefore a priority for the new collective quantified goal for climate finance to be negotiated at COP29 in Baku. The report also found that, based on the latest available data, debt interest payments of developing countries excluding China were larger than estimated adaptation finance needs. This could potentially provide opportunities for debt reform in support of adaptation action. Next slide. Meeting the climate challenge requires not only greater adaptation finance volumes, but also a more strategic approach to investment. Current adaptation financing is short-term, project-based, and reactive. To meet the climate change challenge, adaptation financing needs to shift to more anticipatory, strategic, and transformational action. This requires investment in all areas that are typically harder to finance. Over 2/3 of estimated finance needs are in the areas typically financed by the public sector because they have public good characteristics or are in social or non-market sectors. At the same time, 1/3 of finance needs are in areas that have potential for private financing, such as in market sectors including commercial agriculture, water, and infrastructure. However, even in these cases, there is often a need for public sector finance to de-risk and unlock private investment. The report describes a range of enabling factors and financial instruments that are key for unlocking adaptation finance, especially for the private sector. In addition, the question of who pays for adaptation is also not being adequately addressed. In many financing models, the ultimate costs are borne by developing countries. While this may help bridge the finance gap, it is not in line with the polluter pays principle. Next slide. Reference to capacity building and technology needs are nearly ubiquitous in UNFCCC documents, but ongoing efforts to meet these needs are often uncoordinated, expensive, and short-term. Developing countries express needs for more capacity and technology across all aspects of adaptation planning and implementation, but, as the figure shows, with a focus on agriculture and water. Several factors diminish the effectiveness of the current capacity building and technology transfer provided, which the report describes in detail. To overcome these challenges, interventions to support capacity building and technology transfer should mobilize existing capacities, provide a balanced emphasis on hard technologies and enabling conditions, and place gender equality and social inclusion considerations at their center. Moreover, a more robust evidence base to inform capacity building interventions and technology transfer priorities is needed, including from monitoring and evaluation. Lastly, capacity building and technology transfer should be more holistic, supporting adaptation across sectors, scales, and development priorities, and making them part of broader development strategies. Next slide. In conclusion, to minimize the loss and damage resulting from rising impacts, effective adaptation action incorporating fairness and equity must urgently be scaled up, not least because the poor and vulnerable are hit hardest. COP29 must step up adaptation action by increasing adaptation finance to bridge the gap, strengthen capacity building and technology transfer to improve effectiveness of adaptation planning and implementation, and enhance adaptation planning and implementation to keep up with increasing impacts. Next slide. In the name of the authors, the steering committee, and the production team, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Henry, for that presentation of the key findings. We will launch straight into questions now from our media colleagues. We have a very, very newsy one from Edu from Climatica Spain to begin with, who asks, Spain has just suffered rains and floods unprecedented in decades, with more than 200 deaths and millions of dollars in damage. This shows that countries that are theoretically more developed and with more resources are not prepared to face the new climate reality. What do you think about this?
Maybe I will take that one. There's some that are more technical that I will leave to my eminent colleague. But just to say that clearly, yes, we do, and our hearts go out to the populations and the people of Spain who have suffered, as our hearts go out to every country that suffers climate impacts of this nature. We have seen a devastating impact on livelihoods and on property. And of course, we are seeing a new pattern of severe rainfall, not just in Spain, I will say, but across many, many countries. And I guess we can look at how we would need to look more deeply at the links between these shifts and what we have what we see in the climate projections. But clearly, as the Secretary General say, when we see one catastrophe after the other coming head over heels up behind one another, it is clear that something is amiss. And the tragedy that we are seeing is one that we can see across the world. So all countries, irrespective of their relative wealth, will have an absolute necessity, and it will be critical that they invest in flood management measures, in early warning, as well as drought measures. This means working with farmers, it means working with urban planning, it means working with infrastructure across the whole spectrum of sectors. And as we see, whether it's in Northern Europe or whether it's in Southern Europe, whether it's in US or other countries that have been hit by climate change, all countries will need to invest, as will Spain. And underinvestment is a dimension that is a global phenomenon. So we really need to be clear that if wealthier countries are hit in this manner, just think for a moment about countries that do not have the buffer of wealth to make the best that they can in terms of investments, which is why this report shines a light on adaptation. Yes, wealthier countries will have greater resilience, will not see thousands and thousands of people perish, but 200 lives are too many, and we therefore need to encourage all countries to step up at home, but also to step up in solidarity and live up to the commitments that they have already made under the climate agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson. We have a question from Michael Lohmeyer from Die Presse in Austria, who asks, which country or region suffers the most because of a lack of adaptation? I guess this is based on the report, so we'll start with you, Henry.
Thank you. That's a tough question to answer, I think. As Inga already indicated, and also the Secretary General pointed out, all countries are suffering from the impacts of climate change and will continue to do so, and will increasingly continue to do so because climate change is increasing, and therefore the impacts will increase no matter what. Even with the best efforts in adaptation, that is the case. Now, I would say the countries of the developing world will receive the hardest impacts because they are least able to adapt to these impacts. That is, they are most exposed and they are most vulnerable to the impacts of the climate hazards that we are experiencing increasingly. Therefore, adaptation is very closely connected to development action and needs to be reinforced across the board to lift people's livelihoods up, make them less vulnerable in general terms through improved health, education, water and sanitation. These things reduce the vulnerability of people's lives and livelihoods in the most needy countries, most vulnerable countries. And then at the same time, we need to reduce their exposure through early warning systems and the appropriate measures. But as I said, every country is exposed and everybody needs to make the right preparations to adapt to climate change as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. We have another question from Mr. Lohmeyer. This is about the US election yesterday. Does UNEP have some kind of emergency plan if the US quits any international climate agreements? And if so, what does that look like?
Thank you. Obviously, democracy has spoken, and so that is what it is. And the Secretary General has congratulated the president-elect in the US. But here we are talking about adaptation, and as the Adaptation Gap report shows, adaptation threat is rapidly growing, and as we just heard, no country is immune. And so the impacts are already being felt in the US, and local governors and mayors are seeing that before their very eyes. Hurricane Helene, we saw lives lost, we saw billions of dollars in damages, and the cost of inaction has never been clearer. So I also referenced in my first statement the cost of the emissions gap report, which reinforces that we are really in a climate crunch time. It is urgent that we step up. Anything else will have major impacts on those who may not step up. And therefore, the continuation of current policies, as I mentioned, could have potentially catastrophic climate temperature rises at around 3.1 degrees. And so that impact will hit everyone. No one is immune. And so we are seeing the world, including the US, leaning in on at the private sector level on renewable energy, on electric vehicles, on smart buildings. And that transition is happening at the private sector level. Countries are sort of doubling down in their race to become the renewable energy superpowers. And that will be the bird that gets the worm, so to speak, in terms of market share. And it's really critical that we have good, solid industry that can deliver those solutions for us. Because climate action does make good business sense. And I think that the private sector will very much understand that. So we are calling on, irrespective of elections, that the G20 takes leadership because these are the biggest emitters. And the SG has said very clearly that we will continue to work, as we have always done, with all member states to address these challenges, because all member states are hit by this, and we will need a united world to deliver on the Paris Accord. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just sticking with the sort of catastrophic temperature rise potentially, Jeremy Wilkes from Euronews asks, the WMO says that the last time the planet experienced a comparable concentration of CO2 was 3 to 5 million years ago, when the temperature was 2 to 3 degrees warmer and the sea level was 10 to 20 meters higher than it is now. How on earth do you adapt to that?
So if I may start out, first of all, indeed, yes, when we look at the millennial history and of our planet, then it has gone through these changes, but gone through that over a very, very long time, which meant that whatever species and microorganisms that were in existence could evolve. What is happening here, that these changes are happening in a blink of an eye, which is why and we are already seeing these shifts, species shifts, where species are not able to adapt because some will migrate due to light, others will migrate due to rains, others will migrate due to whatever. And so we are seeing these shifts in phenomenology that has that impact. So the reality is that unless we very much pull the handbrake here, pull the emergency brake, and reduce our CO2 emissions, it would be very hard to make those adaptation requirements. But because we are already seeing, and this is what my colleague, the chief scientific editor, Mr. Neufeld, said, because we are already in a climate changing world, we must adapt to that, which is happening before our very eyes right now. At the same time, we need to decarbonize, we need to live up to our promise of net zero. And that is a commitment that we made to each other back in 2015 in Paris. And without that, we will head into some very catastrophic future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have Vivian Chime from, I believe, Climate Home News, who says, despite the gap in adaptation finance, most of it comes as loans and not grants. What would be your message to developed countries in giving more concessional and grant-based finance to developing countries?
Well, obviously, one of the conversations that happened at the World Bank IMF annual meeting is exactly around this, because the debt burden, and as I think Dr. Neufeld's report also bears out, the debt burden by developing countries is very heavy. And obviously, the injustice of the fact that countries that have taken on debt to do development and activities that were in line with their development plan, and then they get hit by some catastrophic climate event and get put 20 years back, are unable to access the markets because they are at the borderline in terms of debt. when these catastrophes are unheard of and coming in very rapid succession. I think Prime Minister Mia Mottley has spoken very clearly around this. And so clearly the issue around debt and finding concessional finance as well as grant finance will become critical. I'll hand it over to Henry because he's done some nice analysis of the kind of instruments that could potentially be available and the kind of pathways that countries can take.
Yes, so thank you, Inger. I think we show in the report very clearly that grant-based financing is the best way to provide support to adapt to climate change to developing countries, because that's the model in which the beneficiaries do not pay. All other models, including concessionary finance, always have an element of the beneficiaries returning some of the funds in forms either to repay loans, or the development banks that are receiving these funds, national development banks pass them on in forms of services. So the beneficiaries always have to contribute to the benefits that they're receiving and the adaptation that they can use and reduce their risks to climate impacts. So changing these rules, as Inger just explained, is very, very important at the global scale, and to provide more concessional finance is also important. And in addition, we need to increase, of course, the finance available to adapt to climate change, which we know is much, much smaller than the amount needed to adapt. And for that, we need innovative models. We need enabling factors that help unlock private sector finance, but also enable domestic public sector support to adapt better to the impacts. And that is true both for developing countries and for developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question that's been asked by a couple of people. This is really about the gap and the size of the gap. We were asked yesterday by AFP if we could explain why the gap is so big, 187 billion to 359 billion. And we will ask a similar question today. So maybe if you could just sort of explain broadly how you come about with that number.
Yes, I'll take that question. So we have two approaches to assessing the needs and costs of adaptation. One is a modeling approach, basically using global assessment models and damage functions to assess the damage costs over time in different sectors, and we can aggregate that up and break it down by different countries. And then we come up with this lower figure of $187 billion per year. And the other methodology we use is to aggregate up and extrapolate the needs provided by developing countries themselves for their adaptation priorities. And this is done in a sophisticated way to balance different countries' sizes. And this value is higher, and it ends up at over $380 billion per year. So somewhere between these two figures is our adaptation finance need, the real one, which we don't know. And that we put into the context of the adaptation finance flows. And here we see that basically we're in a range of 1 to 10. We got roughly $30 billion coming in through support and roughly $300 billion in needs, somewhere between 200 and 300 billion. So that's 1 to 10. And how to raise that, how to bridge that gap, that's what the COP negotiations in Baku must be about. The NCQG is really critical in that context. And in our opinion, it needs to look at the finance needs of developing countries when it is negotiated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. I think we have time for just one last question, which I think rounds it up quite nicely following the two gap reports that we've just released. Again, it's from Jeremy Wilkes at Euronews. Considering that the latest climate and emissions data, is it time for the UN to abandon Keep 1.5 alive?
Well, as our emissions gap report showed, we are edging towards the time when this may be very difficult to keep it alive. But in our emissions gap report that we released last week, we did show that with a massive step up, particularly by the G20 countries and other high emitting countries, it can still be reached. Now, that means that we would need to see a significant buildup of renewables and massive investments on forestry. But forestry holds a significant potential to reduce the emissions. Or to capture carbon, I think it's around 17% that would be shaved off by solid forest management. So the thought is very much, don't give up yet. Now, you will recall that we have called the various reports the closing window, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at the titles of our report, and this report this year, we titled, I'm just looking for it. Okay, now I can't find it. But anyway, yeah, we titled the last sentence, "No More Hot Air, Please," really calling for countries to step up and not just give empty promises. The point is, and the reality is, that the science does not lie. And as we get closer and closer to that point of no return, our messages are getting more and more urgent. We are calling on very ambitious NDCs 3.0. We are calling on the G20 countries to step up and to make a 47% decrease in their emissions. What we saw last year was a 1.3% increase between 2022 and 2023. Therefore, we are heading in the wrong direction. And so only extraordinary action under the leadership of the G20 is what is required. Now, having attended the G20 meeting of climate and environment ministers in Brazil, there was a good and solid discussion. Now we need to see that translate into the NDCs that will be delivered next year. That will be the moment of a reality check, and then we can revisit your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Many thanks to our panel, Ms. Anderson and Mr. Neufeld, and thank you to the media colleagues who joined us. We will have to wrap up now. We remain available should you have questions. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Goodbye.